This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So this first panel, which I'm chairing, is going to be looking at working mothers, trends and issues across a range of cultures, Britain, Sweden and Italy, and across disciplines, history, literature and sociology. Now the first paper is by Thane, who is Professor at Contemporary British History at King's College London. Her title is Mothering and Work in Britain, Past and Present, but I'm going to have to pretend to be Pat because yesterday she emailed me saying her voice was going and she would be unable to come, or likely to be unable to come to give her paper. So she said if she wasn't here by the start, we should start without her, and I said that I'd read her paper for her. So you will hear her paper. Unfortunately, she won't be here to answer questions on it, but I think that it will provide a useful comparative aspect of the panel. So this is Pat Thane's paper. The dilemmas of combining unpaid work in the home with paid work outside or inside the home are not at all new. Throughout history, working class mothers have combined paid work, domestic work and child rearing from economic necessity. Their young children were cared for by relatives, often grandparents, neighbours or friends, or by older children, usually, but not exclusively daughters. It needs to be stressed that publicly provided childcare has always been very poor in Britain, except in the two world wars when women were needed in the labour market. There were improvements under the Labour governments of 1997 to 2010, but it has remained generally poor compared with other European countries, despite persistent campaigns by women for improved provision. Generally, poor mothers work for pay because their male partners could not earn enough to support the family. But lone mothers always had special difficulties because they had to support their children alone in a situation in which women have always had access to more limited work opportunities than men and to lower pay. Again, we have to remember that none of this is new in Britain. Lone mothers weren't invented in the permissive 60s. There were as many in the late 19th century as in the late 20th. The main reason in the 19th century was death of the partner. In the late 20th and 21st centuries, it was partnership breakup or voluntary single motherhood. In the past, men were more likely to die in early or middle adulthood than women. Also, widowed men were more likely to remarry than women, and then as now, partnerships broke up, generally leaving the mother caring for the children on a depleted income and having to earn their living at times when the welfare system was even less supportive than it is now. The rate of widowhood declined by the 1930s due to a general fall in death rates, including among young and middle-aged men. In the 1930s, only 5% of marriages were ended by the death of a partner within 10 years, and 79% of all couples reached 25 years undivided by death or divorce. Divorce was rarer at this time because it was expensive and difficult to obtain. Before that, in the 1880s, 13% of marriages were ended by death within 10 years, 37% within 25 years. At this time also, women had more children than in the 1930s and before, and childbearing often continuing until menopause, increasing the risk of lone motherhood of young children. In the post-Second World War period, from 1945 to the late 1960s, marriage, parenthood and the family went through unprecedented change in Britain. From the end of World War II until the early 1970s, marriage rates increased and marriage at least one time became almost universal. This was new because until World War II, for as far back as we have information, significant numbers of people in England and Wales never married. In the 1930s, still, 15% of women and 9% of men never married. This was partly because women were a majority of the population, not just because of deaths in World War I, but because women had longer life expectancy at all ages than men and were less likely to emigrate. This doesn't explain why 9% of men didn't marry. The reasons for higher marriage rates after the war were probably the evening up of the sex ratio together with increasing prosperity. The post-Second World War period in present-day discourse is often represented as a historical norm of long-lasting stable marriages. It was actually, historically, very unusual in the rate of marriage, in the extent of long-lasting marriage, and in the fact that most marriages produced children. Childless marriages were previously more common, probably due to poverty, poorer diets, poorer health, and high infant death rates. Family size was smaller than in previous centuries, but a higher proportion of women had children, and the children survived. Infant death rates were very high until the 1930s. The post-war period was unusual also in that the average age at first marriage fell from a norm over the previous 300 years of around 27 for men and 25 for women to a mean in 1971 of 22 for women and 24 for men. This was probably because rising living standards enabled couples to afford marriage at earlier ages. Children were usually born early in marriage. Early marriage and childbirth restricted women's opportunities to gain work experience and qualifications before taking a break, sometimes permanently, for child rearing. While marriages lasted longer than ever before or since because they started at earlier ages, were less likely to be broken by death in young adulthood or middle age, as life expectancy grew and divorce was still hard to obtain. Never in English history have so many marriages lasted so long as between the late 1940s and the early 1970s. Whether they were contented is another question. The very high divorce rates when divorce became easier in 1969 may suggest otherwise. Ignore it, or maybe, no, that's right. Until World War II, middle-class mothers were very rarely in paid employment and faced severe social disapprobation if they did so. A formal marriage bar excluded women from many forms of employment when they married. This was introduced in the civil service and private sector white-collar jobs as soon as women entered them in the later 19th century. Effectively, it excluded married women from competing with men for promotion to senior levels. But it was also introduced into gender-divided occupations such as school teaching, and when women eventually entered university teaching, still few in the interwar years, a woman who married a colleague was expected to give up her job. Well, this lasted at least until the 1960s. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, many middle and upper class women did work outside the home, not for pay, but in the large voluntary sector, helping poorer people and campaigning for better conditions. It should not be disparaged as the condescending dilettantism of Ladies Bountiful, as it often is. It was often very committed, serious and difficult work. The marriage bar spread into more working class occupations during the high unemployment years between the wars, again due to fears that women might exclude men from work. It dwindled and eventually disappeared during World War II because women were vital to the labour force, though it lingered in banking at least into the 1960s. Thereafter, women generally stayed in the full-time workforce until pregnant with their first child. After World War II, increasing numbers of middle-class women entered the workforce, often part-time after their children started school. Inadequate childcare provision for under-5s and for school children after school and in the holidays, after wartime nurseries closed, left mothers of all classes, there's a pack there to take, with little choice. And as we will see, work by mothers of under-5s was socially censored. Part-time work expanded rapidly after the war, from 11% of female employment in 1951 to 25% in 1961, 40% in 1975 and 45% in 1998. Hourly pay and employment rights were generally much poorer in part-time work, though the latter improved under the Labour government in the early 21st century. The range of work open to women, however well qualified, remained limited and pay remained low. There's a pack there for you. Before the 1970s, it was difficult for married women returners to get retraining, and they often had to enter lower grade work than they hoped. It's sometimes thought that after their work was in such demand during the war, after 1945 women were pressured by the government to return to the home. This was true of younger women because the government was anxious to reverse the low pre-war birth rate. But mothers of school-age children were encouraged to work at least part-time because there was a severe and unusual labour shortage as the economy revived strongly after the war. After the war, more middle-class mothers than ever before entered the paid workplace. At the same time as living standards rose with full employment through the late 1940s and 1950s, more working-class women than ever before could stay at home, at least when their children were young. Oh, this was liberation for these women, freedom from a long historical double burden of paid and unpaid work. Many working class women also returned to work, though, often part-time when their children were at school. At this very time, when more middle-class mothers were in paid work and fewer working-class mothers, of whom there were more in the population, social censure of working mothers became stronger than ever before. This was fueled by the growing influence of psychologists arguing on very inadequate evidence that children who were not cared for by full-time by their mothers in their first 5 years were likely to become juvenile delinquents, as youth crime was then described. Most influential was the flawed work of John Bowlby. In his view, no substitute care would do. This all began in the interwar years as psychology and psychiatry became more influential internationally, but became much stronger during and after the war. Yet at this time, more British mothers than ever before cared for their own young children. More working-class mothers could stay at home instead of delegating care for others. Middle-class mothers could no longer delegate childcare to servants, as they had for centuries, whether or not they were active outside the home. Servants became scarce when working-class women could get better jobs amid post-war full employment, and few substitutes were available. Though in the 1950s, the middle classes discovered the foreign au pair as the answer, in particular to after-school and school holiday care and other domestic tasks. Nevertheless, mothers of even school children were castigated for going out to work. If they were not at home for them after school, these latchkey kids, as they were popularly known, were alleged to be potential delinquents. Interestingly, at this time, when most mothers were in marriages, married mothers who worked were seen as the source of social breakdown. Since the early 1990s, the blame has switched to single mothers not in work, as the numbers of single mothers grew. These mothers are blamed for not working even when their children are small. Fathers didn't escape censure either. In the post-war years, fathers who did not spend time with their children, playing football with them rather than changing nappies, for example, but rather spent long hours at work or in the pub or in the gentleman's club, which is less often mentioned, they were castigated for failing to provide good role models for their sons, and so risking fating them to delinquency, that word again. Again, the blame was directed at married fathers living with their families. Now, the same critique is directed at irresponsible fathers living apart from their families. It's an interesting move. The social censure gradually diminished through the 1960s and 70s, not least because the psychological evidence was increasingly criticised and found wanting, and the numbers of mothers employed full or part-time continued to grow. Or gradually improving educational and work opportunities, including for retraining, helped, along with the effects of the Equal Pay Act in 1970, the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975, and campaigns by the revived women's movement after 1968. Women campaigned for equality in the workplace and in the home. They insisted, as the very active first wave women's movement of the 1920s and 1930s had done, that mothering and domestic work in the home were work and should be recognised and rewarded as such, for example by family allowances. The Equal Pay Act brought a gradual narrowing of the gender pay differentials, though it has still not been eliminated, and the Sex Discrimination Act improved work opportunities, though slowly and incompletely. The numbers of working mothers increased particularly through the 1980s and 1990s, as housing and other costs and high unemployment among men put pressure on family incomes. At the same time, the numbers of single mothers rocketed due to the growth of divorce, separation and unmarried motherhood, from 7% of families with dependent children in 1971 to 20% in 1996. Since mothers usually suffered reduced income after separation, they needed and generally wanted to work when possible. The employment rates of single mothers fell amid the high unemployment, benefit and childcare cuts of 1980s and early 1990s under Conservative governments, then rose from 1997 to 2010 under Labour governments, which provided improved childcare advice and training for work. Towards the end of the 20th century, mothers took less time off for childcare, often reluctantly, because they needed the income and or feared realistically to lose their jobs or promotion if they did not return. Nevertheless, evidence persistently showed a substantial mother gap in earnings, i.e. not only was there a persistent gender gap in average earnings, on average 15% in 2012, 55% in the financial sector, but there was a further gap between female workers with and without children. In 2000, it was estimated that a mid-skilled mother of two foregoes $381,000 in lifetime earnings compared with a man with equivalent education. A gender earnings gap of $241,000 and a mother gap of $140,000. A low-skilled mother of two experienced a £482,000 lifetime mother gap. A high-skilled mother of two, $161,000. These gaps are unlikely to have improved significantly since 2000, especially given the economic troubles of the decade. Mothers worked longer despite continuing scarcity of daycare. British public daycare provision continues to be among the worst in OECD countries. That's the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a worldwide, so you're looking at worldwide. Grandparents played a vital role in enabling mothers to work. Grandparents have always contributed to the care of grandchildren, though it is only recently we have had statistics. Increasing numbers of grandparents help younger people in employment by caring for grandchildren, sometimes retiring from paid work themselves to do so. At present, 1 in 3 working mothers rely on grandparents for childcare. 1 in 4 of all working families. 43% of children under 5 whose mothers are employed are looked after by a grandparent. Grandparental care is most common in poorer families, but not exclusive to them. And 40% of grandparental care is provided by grandfathers. Parental rights in employment improved only slowly in Britain. By the 1990s, the UK was much criticised by the EU for lagging behind in provision of parental leave. A small maternity benefit had been payable to insured women and the wives of insured men under National Health Insurance since 1911, but it was designed to help mothers pay for medical care in childbirth rather than to compensate for earnings. The benefit was increased by the post-1945 Labour government, but withdrawn by the Conservative government in 1987. By the 1980s, maternity leave was available in some occupations, more commonly in the public than the private sector, and was often linked to length of service. The Labour government in 1999 introduced a right to 3 months unpaid parental leave and 18 weeks paid maternity leave. It also much improved employment rights for part-time workers influenced by the EU, particularly benefiting working mothers. Paternity leave was introduced in 2001, allowing fathers a whole 2 weeks paid leave, though it was paid at such low levels that many fathers preferred to take better paid holiday leave when a child was born. In January 2010, fathers were given the right to take 6 months statutory paternity leave while their partners returned to work. The payment is no more than £135.45 per week, though some employers may allow more. Current stringent economic and welfare policies, combined with the international crisis, are severely reducing employment opportunities for all women, while daycare becomes even scarcer and more expensive, and welfare benefits are cut. March 2012 figures from the Office of National Statistics show that women's unemployment, full plus part-time, then stood at 1.13 million, the highest rate for 25 years. The statistics do not distinguish between mothers and other female workers, but it is unlikely that mothers are faring better in the job market than others. If anything, the reverse, due to the rising cost of childcare. The female unemployment rate has increased by 20% since 2009, whereas male unemployment has remained stable. This is largely because women are disproportionately employed in the public sector, which has suffered disproportionate cuts since 2010. The Office of National Statistics figures show that the number of women in involuntary part-time work, i.e. they would prefer to work full-time, rose by 45,000 in 2011 to 2012. Changes in benefit conditions have made it harder for single mothers to combine work and childcare. These are likely to become harsher still from April 2013. The rising cost of childcare is a major obstacle to mothers working, and is reported to be leading to some mothers giving up work because they can't afford it. According to the Daycare Trust, in 2011-12, nursery costs rose on average by 5.8% for a child under 2, by 3.9% for a child aged 2 and over, while wages rose on average by only 0.3%. 44,000 fewer families received help with childcare costs following the tax credit cut in the April 2012 budget, while others received less help than before. Childminder costs have risen by up to 3.9%. There are major gaps in childcare provision across Britain, especially for disabled children and parents who work outside normal office hours. Single parents are disproportionately parents of disabled children. It's never been easy to be a mother in paid work in Britain. Currently, it is becoming harder, perhaps harder than ever before. Right, that's the end of Pat's paper. Ends on